Hello. Hi, Kay. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Avril. Unlike a phone. Hi, Dr. Joe and all Saint Faithfuls. Saint Faithfuls, huh? Wow. Okay, that's pretty good for tonight. Happy almost Thanksgiving, everyone. We haven't started enjoying Thanksgiving yet, though we were enjoying the day before it. But there's a conflict that's going on now, and that conflict is spreading beyond the first round of announcements that was made by Joe Biden and is concerned with the scuttlebutt about some other cabinet picks that he's considering. Okay. And progressives are reacting very strongly to those picks. Of course, the title of this is Keep the Deficit Hawks Out. That it's not only focused on deficit hawks, there's another group also, corporate candidates, people who have been connected to large corporations or who lobby for large corporations. Of course, there's considerable overlap between these two groups as well. Generally speaking, if people work for large conservative corporations, then come into the federal government, they usually happen to be deficit hawks as well, or at least are against getting too generous in the way of deficit spending when that spending is for the well being of people as opposed to the well being of corporations. As you know, the way this works is whenever the corporations get in trouble, it's let's run and let's do whatever we have to do and spend whatever money we have to spend in order to get them out of trouble. But somehow, when people get into trouble, but because the economy tanks, even though it's no fault of their own, well, we don't have to do anything to help those people. The economy will take care of itself, and eventually they will be helped. In the meantime, if they get thrown out of their homes, or if they go into bankruptcy, or if they die because they can't afford health insurance, no, that's just the normal course of events. That's just the natural order. We, the corporate candidates, we, the deficit hawks, don't have to do anything about that because we're all right, Jack. So that's the way it works. For us, it's just hard cheese. For them, it's, let's do everything we can to pull them out of trouble. Kay says, I tagged Evelina Pont in my share as she missed it last night. Oh, thank you, Kay. Avril says, comments kept interrupting the stream last night, but that's good tonight. I'm glad it's good tonight. I don't know why the comments would interrupt the stream last night, but there are often things beyond our control here. Please do share as much as you can. Let's go through the news shaping up about what might be done about the economy and also the news relating to the deficit hawks and the corporate candidates. Avril says, oops, I spoke too soon. As soon as I press send or post comment, everything stopped. Evelina says, hi, everyone. Hello, Evelina. So glad you're here. Okay, so let me share the first of the pieces I want to cover. I'm not going to cover this in full detail, piece by Dave Dayen at the American Prospect, and it's called Being Thankful in a Pandemic. I recommend it for reading. The first part is about the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic, a kind of silver lining that's there in spite of all the suffering there has been, in the pandemic. He draws some conclusions about that. And he says the pandemic has made us a more social people. And the second of the lessons is the pandemic has helped us better understand the dignity, of work. That has to do with the essential workers, how we have now come to realize some people are really essential in keeping us going. And often they're busting their neck, as Joe Biden says, for not enough pay. So we've been learning that. And we've also been learning that the pandemic has highlighted the importance of investment in science. And Dave thinks that we're going to see a comeback in terms of the importance of science in our society because, of course, it has been essential in developing the vaccines that may now save us. What I want to focus on, though, in this particular post of Dave's is his discussion of Steve Mnuchin again and the idea that he's now taken $455 billion in funds that was appropriated for Fed credit facilities and direct lending to companies and segregated them somehow in the Treasury General Fund. In other words, the idea being that he has taken these funds back from the Fed. And specifically, according to Bloomberg, this means the money would require a congressional authorization to be unlocked and put to use by the Fed, or anyone else. Dave thinks, and I agree, and I'll explain why in a minute, this doesn't appear to be required, despite what Secretary Mnuchin and the Republicans claim. A careful analysis by Peter Conti Brown indicates that Fed has authority well beyond the CARES Act to make loans, and Treasury is making a choice withdrawing any funds. Well, that may be true, but I think it's irrelevant for reasons I'll get into in a little while. Furthermore, it's completely unclear the Fed needs to use a deposit base from Treasury to make the aforementioned loans. The New York Fed's John Williams appears to agree. But furthermore, this is all an accounting gimmick, as Nathan Tankus has explained. And he has explained that. According to Dave, Janet Yellen, I'll get into what Nathan has to say in just a minute, can rescind the secretary's action, but it's not really necessary for her to do so. The Fed might want some cover politically, but they have plenty of authority on their own. Dave says, I don't actually presume the Fed will do much that's useful with the money, even if Yellen gave it back. So I see this as mostly a sideshow. And I think the relevant reference there, the most important one, is to Nathan Tankus and what he has to say. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but basically the idea, which is backed up by a piece from Scott Fulwiler and collaborators of Scott's, okay, is that the way this was financed actually was the following. First of all, Congress appropriated $500 billion to help certain sectors, okay, of the economy. 45 billion of it was allocated to the airline industry to keep payroll intact in the airline industry until, I think it was September, so they wouldn't have to fire staff. Now, this was something Sarah Nelson got for her people, okay, in the airline industry. This left 455 billion of the 500 billion that was this part of the CARES Act. Okay. That 455 billion was appropriated with the expectation, in fact, it was part of the CARES Act, that it was going to be turned over to the Fed, who would set up a loan facility. In fact, actually a number of loan facilities for it, including loan facilities for municipal local governments as well, but also for corporations too. So there were to be a number of these particular loan facilities, and the Fed was given the authority by Congress, which it did not really need, but the basic concept was that the Fed would be able to lend out 10 times the amount of the appropriation, which again was $455 billion. 10 times $455 billion is $4.55 trillion. That was the money cannon that was talked about so frequently by Dave Dayen. Okay. He rounded it off to 4.6 trillion, but it was really the 4.55 trillion. Now, it turns out that for a variety of reasons I will not go into, the corporations did not have to take advantage of the loan facility. The reason why was just because it was there backing the corporations, they were able to issue securities of their own, which were bought by the public in order to generate money for them that they could use to tide themselves over, to bail themselves out, basically. So they never did have to use the government loan facility, or largely anyway, they did not have to use that. Specifically, they ended up using only 26 billion of the 455 billion that had been appropriated by Congress. So only $260 billion was loaned out from the 4.55 trillion loan facility at the Fed. So 429 billion remained of what was appropriated. And that's the way the situation stands today. There's an appropriation of 425 billion that can be used by the Treasury to enable the Fed to produce the rest of the money cannon. So Steve Mnuchin comes into this situation. He says, this should expire at the end of the year. In my view, that was the intent of Congress. And so I'm going to take back the money. The only thing is, there was never any actual reserves involved. What you have to understand is the appropriation that was made by Congress is distinct from any new reserves that at some point in time can possibly appear in the Treasury account. And the Treasury never produced any reserves for the Federal Reserve to use. Instead, they produced some special purpose bonds that were non-marketable, special purpose securities that were non-marketable, and they sent those over to the Fed. So if I'm right, the Fed has $455 billion worth of Treasury securities. Of course, Treasury has an unlimited power to issue securities as long as they're non-marketable facilities. It's perfectly possible for Treasury to produce these securities and to give them to the Fed in order to back the loan facility, in order to provide the backing for the loan facility that the Fed never really needed anyway, but they were looking for cover. This was an accounting gimmick. And there was $455 billion in these special securities that was given by the Treasury to the Fed. And the Fed still has that. As far as I know, those particular securities can't be simply taken back by the Treasury Department. They've been given to the Fed for use in executing the appropriation. So I'm not sure what was done by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, but there were no reserves to take back from the Fed. There were only these Treasury security vehicles to be taken back from the Fed. And we don't have details on how exactly the Fed would convey those things back to the Treasury Department. So, as far as I know, the Fed and Jay Powell over at the Fed still has these particular securities. And since these securities are there to back an appropriation, a mandated appropriation by the Congress, it seems to me that the authority is still there and will be there after the first of the year, before Jay Powell to set up these facilities if he so desires. But of course, Nathan Tankus and Dave Dayen and Scott Fulwiler are all right in saying that in order to set up a loan facility, these particular securities, or reserves were not necessary anyway, because the Fed on its own authority would be able to set up a loan facility specifically under Section 14 of the Fed law, as was specified by Robert Hockett in a piece that I went over last week. So this all seems to be a tempest in a teapot. The capability to do loans, okay, is still there. I'm not sure of the mechanics of the Fed actually returning the securities over to Mnuchin. I don't know if that has really happened or whether it's going to happen or how it can happen. Okay, Jay Powell did not want to end by this particular program. He thought the economy was still weak, okay, to end it. I don't know how Mnuchin would require him to end it. It seems to me for Mnuchin to require him to end it, it would be necessary to have the Congress take back the appropriation that had been made in this instance. I don't think it's within Mnuchin's authority to do that. But regardless, it's a tempest in a teapot because the Fed has the capability to make these loans anyway under Section 14. Okay, the loans themselves, in accordance with this appropriation, are being made under Section 13.3 of the Fed Act. I hope you understand all this. Okay, it's a bit confusing, but the bottom line here is that if you're interested in the details of the argument, a careful presentation is by Nathan Batankis. It's outlined in Substack, actually. I believe today. And so you can go to Substack, okay, and to Nathan's blog there. And the title of his article on this is "What the Hell is Going On with CARES Act's Funds? The Federal Reserve, by useless accounting gimmick, quote unquote, comes back to bite." Okay, and Nathan goes into the full details of this, complete with the his analysis of the T accounts, showing the transfers of assets and liabilities. It's really, really funny. One of the obvious points he makes is the Federal Reserve can simply create more settlement balances elsewhere in order to make payments. So, for example, the $1 trillion platinum coin could easily take the place, okay, of an SPV security, but that's the special bonds that were given by the Treasury Department to the Fed, with no operational differences. And to underline this point, he shows us the Federal Reserve's own quarterly financial statements showing the balances, the assets and the liabilities that are in the consolidated accounts, okay, of the Federal Reserve. So this is all very funny. It explains why this is an accounting gimmick. And I'm going to leave it for you to further investigate, okay, at this point. I'm going to stop sharing this and go on to the next piece of news. But of course, from an MMT point of view, that particular piece was quite important. Nathan Tankes's piece and Dave Dayen's piece calling attention to that. So let me go to the next one. I'll share the screen for that too. People have been talking about the possibility of a double dip recession. And this post, by Dave, is about that. JP Morgan Chase analysts have been predicting a double dip. I've been predicting a depression rather than a double dip. But the bank is claiming the first quarter of 2021 will be recessionary. Dave says, but it seems to me that could happen this quarter, and I agree with him. I think we're already seeing it. Los Angeles County just suspended outdoor dining, which is going to destroy, its restaurant industry. But the bigger threat, says Dave, is the personal lockdown, not anything government will impose. Regardless of whether more restrictions get rolled out, the majority of people will huddle in their homes until the case surge blows over. The economy is getting a burst with Thanksgiving travel, which is above the low level of the pandemic, and will get more with holiday shopping. But that travel could also cause an equal and opposite reaction of more infections. So December could look like March and April of this past year, even as the vaccine starts getting into the arms of the frontline workers. Just 2 weeks of shutdown in March was enough to push the numbers negative for that quarter, for the first quarter. We might get the 2 weeks of shutdown here in December easily. Of course, whether GDP is above or below water is kind of an irrelevant sideshow in the midst of an economic picture that resists easy characterization. He goes further, talks about the U.S. consumer holding up, stories about that. Says he hasn't seen much beyond September about consumers holding up, leaving out a couple of months with little or no CARES Act spending going out. He points out that an incredible 20% of downtown businesses in Madison, Wisconsin have closed for good. And the Guitar Center is the latest retail outlet to hit on the bankruptcy. 1 in 4 people in Rhode Island cannot meet their basic food needs. And even in the aggregates, the monthly job openings are falling. The poverty rate is rising. Those millions of people suffering aren't just getting the cold shoulder from Congress. They're about to get dumped on the street with nothing. We're now starting to see the term COVID cliff to represent the number of relief policies that expire at the end of September. This includes 2 key unemployment programs giving benefits to 12 million people, the freeze on student loan payments, the makeshift and relatively ineffective moratorium on evictions, which, if it expires, could unleash a flood of 6 million dispossessions and boost to the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which have quietly increased paychecks for the working poor. This is on top of the enhanced unemployment benefits that expired months ago and hazard pay increases long pulled back by private businesses such as Amazon, of course. People unaffected by the crisis have been saving because there's nothing to do. But that other America has been in recession or worse for several months. There's no double dip here, says Dave. correctly. Just one long season of misery. Top of that, on December 11th, the government runs out of spending authority, and we could legitimately see another shutdown, even though both sides claim to not want one. Our terrible welfare systems are to blame here, forcing patch-up solutions that ran out long before the need did. Now, Democratic leaders, including the president-elect, are pushing for a quick stimulus package to avert the double dip, though it's unclear whether they have a negotiating partner um, in the Senate. So again, what we need is a bridge, as vaccine distribution will bring back a host of businesses that cannot otherwise function. We can see the end in sight and just have to prevent destruction and scarring for millions for a short while. One needs a very large amount of spending to provide support, but you don't need it for an extended period the way you did in March. The failure of the CARES Act to extend to full level of need is not as much of a pitfall now, but doing nothing would be an absolute and monumental disaster for millions of neglected and invisible Americans. They're the hardest groups to get in the front of mind of policymakers, and they risk being left behind again, says Dave. And again, he is absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, going to the next piece to paint this picture. Enter stage left, Donald Trump, or I guess he's always been there. Trump is trying to set Yellen and Biden up to fail as he sabotages the economy. And there's Yellen and Biden, and there is Mr. Trump. I suppose I should still say President Trump. News that President-elect Joe Biden intends to nominate former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen. Now, this is an article from Truthout, okay, and it's by Alexis Goldstein. It was published on November 24th, 2020. She's a very good writer who's come out of the Occupy movement along about, when was it, 2011, 2012 now. News that President-elect Joe Biden intends to nominate former Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen, first Fed chair to acknowledge the problems caused by inequality, to serve as Treasury Secretary, broke just yesterday. During her time as chair of the Federal Reserve, she was receptive to progressives who pushed the Fed to be more responsive to communities of color. Upon hearing the news of her nomination, Senator Warren called her, quote, smart, tough, and principled, unquote. However, as Fed chair, she could have done more to advance financial regulation. She rarely spoke out on the topic until the 2017 warning against the regulatory rollbacks of the Trump administration. This was a warning some speculated was the reason Trump failed to renominate her as the Fed chair. However, the Washington Post reported a similar, more insulting reason. Trump decided not to renominate her as Fed chair because he thought she was too short. I don't know about that, but that's funny anyway. As Treasury Secretary, Yellen will now have her work cut out for her, as both she and Biden are inheriting a messy situation made even messier by Trump's active attempts at sabotage. Trump administration continues to stymie President-elect Biden's transition. It took more than 2 weeks before GSA head Emily Murphy finally acknowledged on November 23rd that Joe Biden is the winner of the election. As a result, federal funds meant to go to the transition had been held up and Biden and Harris will only now begin to receive briefings on the status of vaccine distribution plans and other pandemic response matters. In a statement in response to the GSA news, the Biden transition team said it would begin meetings quickly to discuss the pandemic and national security and to, quote, gain complete understanding of the Trump administration's effort to hollow out government agencies. The long delay to start of the formal transition is hardly the only way that the Trump administration is working furiously to sabotage the incoming administration. Trump officials are also making moves to make future diplomacy, economic recovery, and climate change remediation more difficult. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who's not acknowledged Joe Biden's victory, spent the last week and a half creating diplomatic outrage across the world. In Paris, he met with reporters from the right-wing the French magazine Valeurs Actuelles, which was criticized for its racism after it printed an image depicting a black French lawmaker as a slave. Then Pompeo became the most senior U.S. official to visit an Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank. He traveled to a winery built on land claimed by Palestinians. The Israeli owned winery had previously named the wine after Pompeo. Amazing, right? Most in the international community, including the UN, consider these settlements illegal under the Geneva Convention. I'm one of the most. I believe they're illegal under the Geneva Convention. But Pompeo announced that the U.S. will allow goods produced in Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory to use a made in Israel, quote unquote, label. Pompeo also visited the Israeli occupied Golan Heights in Syria. Syria condemned the visit, calling it provocative, quote unquote, and a, quote, flagrant violation, unquote, of Syrian sovereignty, which of course it is. Stephen Miles, executive director of Win Without War, described Pompeo's 10-day tour as a way to actively sabotage Joe Biden. Shadi Hamid, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, said to Bloomberg that Pompeo was spending the remainder of his time in office, quote, trolling the world, unquote. It's not just diplomatic problems the outgoing Trump administration is causing. It appears to be attempting to create economic ones as well. Last week, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin said he would shut down most of the Federal Reserve's emergency lending programs and return any unused money. I explained why that might be difficult. Since the Fed has only used about $25 billion, that totals some $429 billion. Actually, it must be $26 billion in order to get you to $429 billion. This means the likely end to future loans the Fed could have made to cities and medium-sized businesses in order to help aid the recovery. It's worth noting, though, that the CARES Act only demands that any unused funds be sent back to the Treasury's general fund to be used for reducing the deficit in 2026. This means that Yellen could, in coordination with the Fed, potentially restart the programs in the next administration. I hate to say it, but there's nothing in funds to be sent back to the Treasury's general fund. Any reserves involved here were never created by the Fed, since the Fed only took those special purpose vehicle securities. It's amazing, right? But this means Yellen could, in coordination with the Fed, potentially restart the programs, okay, in the next administration. Yes, I believe that she could. All she would have to do is say, hey, we still got these securities. I think you still have them, right? Let's start up the program again. I mean, the program has been appropriated by Congress. So that's all the authority that would be needed. And in fact, I'm not even sure that that Yellen would be needed for this. I think perhaps only her silence would be needed if Jay Powell simply decided to go ahead and do it. But anyway, House Financial Services Committee Chair Maxine Waters said Trump administration was trying to, quote, spitefully destroy the economy, unquote, with the move. It need not be this way. The Fed could refuse the Treasury's request, just not return those special purpose bonds, right? Thus far, it hasn't, instead releasing a letter that stated it would, quote, work out arrangements, unquote, to return the unused funds. The Biden transition team called the move, quote, deeply irresponsible, unquote, the move of the Treasury, that is. So, maybe what Jay Powell is doing is he's just going to mark time until the Biden team takes over. And then he'll work out arrangements. And then Yellen will tell him, it's okay, you don't have to return these bonds, just make the loans. Congressional Oversight Commission member Bharat Ramamurthy called the Fed's decision disappointing, quote unquote, contrasted the way the Fed got creative, quote unquote, during the 2008 crisis and, quote, stretched every authority to help but big banks to, quote again, doing the bare minimum in 2020 when Congress asked it to help small businesses, states, and cities. Indeed, that the Fed went along with the Treasury implies that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, otherwise known as Jay Powell, may not disagree with the move. Powell has not been eager to heed the many calls for reform to the emergency lending programs, which are intended to be used to boost markets for corporate bonds, state, city, and as well municipal bonds, and provide loans to medium-sized businesses. For example, House Financial Services Committee Chair Maxine Waters and Delegate Michael San Nicolas of Guam repeatedly called on the Fed to loan to U.S. territories through the program. The Fed never made it happen. Given that the Biden administration would likely ask the Fed to ensure most states and cities could participate in the program, it may have been politically convenient for the Fed to let the Treasury shut it down instead. I'm not sure the problem here was Jay Powell. I think the problem was the schedule of interest rates that the Treasury Secretary was requiring the Fed to set up. And this schedule of interest rates established essentially different rates for businesses and for states, okay, and for cities. There were market rates, okay, that were different. And Steve Mnuchin wanted them to be different because he did not want the loan facility to be competing with private sources of funds for states and for cities. The private sources wanted to charge higher interests. So they were accommodated by Mnuchin, crony capitalism, so that cities and states would not use the Fed facilities because the interest rates were too high. That's why only 26 billion of the facilities were used. I believe only 2 states actually borrowed any money from it. So I don't think the Fed was actually the opponent here. I think it was actually Mnuchin who was stopping things from getting going. Because what could have been done to get this going is to simply give the states and cities the same interest rates that businesses were getting under the program. Businesses were getting nearly zero interest rates. If the states and cities had that sort of facility available to them, they wouldn't have thought twice about using the facility. This is hardly the first attempt by the Trump administration at hindering recovery in the new year. Trump administration has thus far refused to extend either the federal student loan suspension or the evictions moratorium, meaning that pending further action, federal student loan borrowers will need to restart payments on January 1st, and renters will be vulnerable to evictions. And the article goes on in this vein, simply listing various things that the Trump administration has done to try to damage the recovery for the new administration coming in. So I will shut this down here. You have the main points of this article already. And now I want to move to consider what, in the middle of this cruelty, in the middle of this depression, or impending depression, I want to now cover what is going on with the cabinet by speculation. Let me see that I got everything here. I don't think I have one link that I meant to get, but I'll get that in a minute. So, I'm going to share this one first. This is another piece from Dave, who's been very busy. Somebody from BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, what BlackRock did was to build what amounted to a shadow government designed to help their CEO, Larry Fink, become Treasury Secretary in a Hillary Clinton administration. This was done, of course, before the election. Numerous former Obama administration officials decamped to BlackRock, giving Fink the connections and expertise he needed to work his way into the Clinton cabinet. That cabinet never materialized, of course. This time around, Janet Yellen has already been given this Treasury Secretary nod, as was reported in previous days by a number of sources, including Kuttner, who reported it first in The Prospect. But BlackRock's influence in a Biden administration has not gone away. The Prospect has learned that Brian Deese, the former Obama administration official who became managing director and global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, is the leading candidate to run the National Economics Council, the NEC, a critical coordinating position at the White House. Now, there are progressive people who are also contending for this post. In particular, Joe Stiglitz is contending for this particular post and would be great at it. Deese, who appears on a hit list of corporate-friendly potential candidates disfavored by progressive activists, held several jobs in the Obama White House, including 4 years at the NEC as special assistant to the president for economic policy and also deputy director. He also did a turn as deputy and acting director of the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and a senior advisor to Obama on climate policy. The last one was an interesting landing spot because Deese had no policy experience with climate. During his tenure, he endorsed the significant rise in fossil fuel production under Obama and defended continuing oil drilling in Alaska and fracking on public land, something even Biden has ruled out. But it's Deese's work at BlackRock that has raised the most recent concern. Activists have spent years trying to get them to divest from fossil fuel companies and other polluters of the climate, and it was Deese's job to counteract them. At BlackRock, quote, at BlackRock, he has not demonstrated that he's willing to push the envelope on bold climate action, said Moira Burse, climate and finance director for Amazon Watch, a nonprofit that fights for rainforest protections and rights for indigenous people. Quote again, in interactions I've had with him, he's been really dismissive of contemplating the impacts of the policies that he's been creating at BlackRock, the impact on real people and frontline the communities. Deese controlled the BlackRock environmental, social, and governance investment strategy, an in vogue designation that makes financiers feel good about their contributions to the world. In this position, Deese made mostly empty promises to environmentalists about the goals of BlackRock, which withered upon close inspection. So you get the idea of this. There are a number of things that BlackRock did to further the climate crisis, not to manage the climate crisis, but not to help with the climate crisis. Okay, but Deese was instrumental in further contributing to the climate crisis through continuation of fossil fuel projects. The company BlackRock issued a statement on agribusiness in February, but it offered little in the way of solutions. The statement, quote, fails to explain what standards it will use to gauge companies' operations and what consequences there will be for companies that continue to drive widespread deforestation. Noted the coalition which is known as BlackRock's Big Problem. So, Deese has made excuses for BlackRock's portfolio, claiming that the firm creates index funds that buy every firm on an exchange and therefore cannot easily divest from climate risking entities. And, quote, I find it very disingenuous, said Moira Burse. And, quote again, but BlackRock in some cases makes its own indices and designs its own funds, makes decisions on what funds to put before clients, unquote. Deese has also argued against divestiture from the fossil fuel industry. So Deese is apparently a bad actor. And he would likely be representing BlackRock as part of the cabinet. rather than representing the interests, okay, of people. He wouldn't be acting for the public purpose. He would be acting for the interests, okay, of BlackRock. The fact that Deese could take over the National Economics Council is notable. The position was created for Robert Rubin in 1993 as a way to bring economic policy coordination inside the White House and weaken the power of the Council of Economic Advisors, a more independent body of economists. NEC directors have been key bottlenecks in past administrations, filtering what advice and information gets to the president. 2009, NEC Director Larry Summers made sure that President Obama was presented only with smaller options for stimulus, ruling out fiscal aid at the level necessary to fill the demand gap. Deese worked with Summers at NEC during Obama's first term. So you see why it's essential that he be blocked. He was one of the deficit hawks. So, since Biden is more of a manager than a fixed type ideologue, what options he gets to see matters significantly. That's why Deese's history inside politics should be just as troubling as his work, okay, at BlackRock. Okay, and it's obvious he's a deficit hawk, okay, as well. In the Obama administration, he worked as a deficit hawk. We have to keep him totally away from the National Economics Council. His appointment as the chair there would be awful and unwarranted because in certain ways he's also economically ignorant too. Deese also gave speeches about entitlement reform and advocated for fiscal discipline and endorsed reduction of deficits. He said at his confirmation hearing for Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget in 2013 that his top priority would be working on a, quote, comprehensive deficit reduction agreement, unquote, which would include entitlement reform, quote unquote. In Washington speak, that typically refers to Social Security and Medicare. In that hearing, he suggested means testing as a potential solution. After leaving the Obama administration, Deese gave paid speeches on topics that included how the budget process can actually be used to reform entitlements and the tax code. He was also a key supporter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the multilateral trade agreement that was eventually rejected by House Democrats and tossed out by President Trump. With a potentially weak U.S. trade representative installed, trade policy would be largely run out of the White House, making the NEC director an even more critical figure. And Progressive have floated other names for the NEC, including former Biden economic advisor Jared Bernstein and progressive economist and Biden advisor Heather Bushey. But as Politico reported today, Obama veterans are skillfully muscling their way into key policy posts, pushing aside many who worked for Biden on the campaign. Deese was an informal advisor to the Obama campaign, but he comes out of that Obama world which has been winning the transition. So there it is. We have to be opposed to Deese. We have to make sure he never gets a top spot in the administration, that he never gets a key spot. That is so important. He needs to be blocked. Last time we talked of Rahm Emanuel getting blocked. Of course, he needed to be blocked as well and needs to be blocked still. But so does Brian Deese. And are there others being actively considered? Yes, there are. First, let's look at the results of some polling. As reported by Common Dreams, this is Jessica Corbett, November 25th. That's today. New polls show 68% of Americans want senators to block any corporate Biden nominees. Bolstering calls for President-elect Joe Biden to keep business insiders and industry lobbyists out of his cabinet. New survey results reveal that 68% of Americans want members of the U.S. Senate to reject any corporate-linked nominees proposed by the incoming president. The Data for Progress poll, they do very useful polls, for the progressives, especially when there are clandestine operations of this kind that are going on to get corporates in there. And the Data for Progress can be counted upon to do a very useful poll. The Data for Progress poll, sponsored by Demand Progress and first reported Tuesday by the Daily Poster, found that a majority of Democrats, Republicans, and Independents across all documented demographics agree about how the Senate should respond to these kinds of nominees. The majority of likely voters surveyed believe that if Biden tries to install corporate executives and lobbyists in top spots of his administration, senators should vote against confirming them and urge the president-elect to, quote, instead put forth nominees who've worked to forward the interests, of everyday Americans. Jared Bernstein would, by the way, be infinitely better than Deese in that position. But as I said, Joe Stiglitz was also reportedly being considered, and he would be better even than Jared Bernstein. Of course, from my point of view, the best person to appoint, to this particular position would probably be Jamie Galbraith, but I have no idea whether Jamie is being considered for this particular post. Failing that, I think, but Jared Bernstein would be pretty good. And also Joe Stiglitz. Dave Sirota tweets, news, as investment banker Rahm Emanuel angles for a top White House job. A new poll shows that if Biden nominates corporate executives or lobbyists to cabinet posts, 68% of Americans want Senate Democrats to vote those nominees down. Even if only 10 Senate Democrats should do that, with the help of Mitch McConnell, it would be easy to block that kind of nominee. But I don't know whether Mitch McConnell might, in that situation, simply join with Biden to get the corporates in there. He might well do that. And then there would be no way to block these nominees. So kind of ironically, to save ourselves from these nominees, we might need the help of the Republicans if Biden goes ahead and continue to try to get them in there. Now, of course, this guy, Brian Deese, even if he's not put into the National Economic Council, Biden might want to put him in as the special trade representative. Another disaster. That would be another disaster. If you recall, just a couple of days ago, they were mentioning Rahm Emanuel as possibly the special trade representative because that was less visible than the position he wanted as Secretary of Transportation. The polling conducted after Election Day in November has a margin of error plus or 3 percentage points. These elections have met with mixed responses from the progressives and others calling on Biden to forego a corporate cabinet. Demand Progress Executive Director David Segal last week said, quote, people dedicated to working in service of the general welfare should be picked. As the Daily Poster noted, along with pushing Biden to break with Clinton and Obama tradition of installing corporate allies in key governmental positions. Demand progress on the revolving door project. Quote, are poll testing potential nominees with descriptions of their backgrounds to gauge potential public support and opposition for Biden cabinet, unquote. For example, the new survey explains that Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, a financial firm which is the largest asset manager and the largest investor in the fossil fuel industry in the world, unquote, before asking whether respondents would support Biden appointing him to a cabinet post. 66% of those polled said they would somewhat or strongly oppose Fink. That's because he's a Fink. The American Prospect, couldn't resist that one. The American Prospect reported Tuesday that Brian Deese, also of BlackRock, is under strong consideration to head Biden's National Economic Council. Half of survey respondents said they oppose Deese. Demand Progress said, read all about why Brian Deese, a greenwasher at BlackRock, must not be given a role in Joe Biden's administration. And there's a link there to Dave Dayen's article, which we just went through. Survey results were similar from Mark by Gittenstein, quote, a corporate lobbyist who has pushed to undo regulations at the behest of large agribusinesses, insurance companies, Wall Street, and defense contractors, unquote, as well as Tony James, Steve Ricchetti, and Rhode Island Governor Gina Raimondo. All four of them, she's a hedge funder, all four of them are not only opposed by a majority of voters, but also targets of the, quote, no corporate cabinet, unquote, campaign. Launched last week by Demand Progress, the Revolving Door Project, and other partner groups. The initiative has persons of interest, quote unquote, a webpage about potential appointees who Biden should avoid, according to organizers. And that's a page you should probably go to. It's linked to from this article. The page features Fink, Gittenstein, James, Deese, also Ricchetti, Raimondo, former Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz, who, by the way, is frequently mentioned as a choice of Biden right now, not been formally announced yet, Jason Bordoff, Heather Zischow, and the ever-present Bruce Reed. The Daily Poster highlighted the corporate ties and progressive critiques of some selections Biden has already announced. And we have here, of course, Tony Blinken and Avril Haines, and the consideration of also Michelle Flournoy, who's the West Exec co-founder, to serve as Secretary of Defense, as well as two corporate lawyers, Sally Yates and Karen Dunn, to serve as Attorney General and the head of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, respectively. Of course, I think you know that choices we would like would be Keith Ellison. And if we really had our druthers, Bill Black as either Attorney General or head of the Justice Department's Antitrust Division. Boy, would I love that. Biden did appease some of the progressives with the nomination of former Federal Reserve Chairman Janet Yellen to serve as his Treasury Secretary. And Biden made a statement today saying he thought there were enough progressives already in his administration. Or maybe he has plans to appoint some other progressives on the economic side and in HUD that we haven't really heard about yet, and his statement was reflecting that. But he was giving the impression that He had already announced their appointments, and of course that was not true. The appointments, that have been announced thus far, the only person who might be considered, a progressive there, and there would be question about that, would be Janet Yellen herself. She would be a rare Treasury Secretary, says the article, who didn't come straight from Wall Street. She has supported deficit spending and tougher banking, but regulations, though she has also echoed some of the austerity rhetoric of groups aiming to cut Social Security, and Medicare. I'm sure that Stephanie Kelton would be able to easily explain to her why you don't save anything by cutting Social Security, and Medicare. Why there's no problem in funding it. In the Data for Progress survey, a majority of respondents said they somewhat or strongly support Biden appointing Yellen to a cabinet position and the Senate confirming her. While the polling shows a bipartisan desire for lawmakers to block Biden from putting together a corporate cabinet, control of the Senate remains uncertain. If Democrats were to win a pair of January the runoff races in Georgia, the party would have 50 seats in the upper chamber, and Vice President Harris could break tie votes. I hope that happens, but if it does happen, it would give some of the progressives in the Senate, it would give them weight, because if they defected and voted against corporate choices, then those corporate choices would not be getting into the cabinet. And particularly if Mitch McConnell was interested in paralyzing the government and blocking Biden's choices. So I just have to mention that in that situation, the few relatively progressive senators there are, such as Ed Markey and Bernie Sanders, by Jeff Merkley, by Sherrod Brown, might have an undue amount of influence that they are not accustomed to. Others would consider it an undue amount of influence. If they really had that sort of influence, I, of course, would celebrate that. So here we are. We're at the final piece that I want to go over, and then I want to deliver my main message for tonight. And his last article is, quote, a major test, unquote, for soul of Biden presidency. AOC, Ilhan Omar, back effort to keep deficit hawk Bruce Reed out of the White House. So coming back to Bruce Reed again. Add your name. See, there's a petition from Justice Democrats, Data for Progress, and Social Security Works. Keep deficit hawk Bruce Reed out of the Biden administration. And Alexandria and Ilhan and Rashida on Tuesday became the first sitting members of Congress to join a new pressure campaign demanding President-elect Joe Biden keep Bruce Reed, an unapologetic architect of Bill Clinton's disastrous, quote, welfare reform, unquote, and notorious austerity proponent, out of the White House. The, quote, no deficit hawks petition, launched by advocacy group Justice Democrats, backed by other progressive organizations, comes as Reed is reportedly under consideration to lead Biden's OMB, the key agency that will be tasked with crafting the incoming administration's budgetary agenda in the middle of a devastating economic crisis. Did I say this article was written by Jake Johnson? I don't think I did. And it was also from this morning. Anyway, this is a follow-on article to the earlier article about the movement to block Reed. But it's not only Reed we have to block. We have to block also Rahm. We have to block Brian Deese. There may be other hawks that we have to block as well. This is critical if we want a recovery. It's critical to get them out of the way. They stand for austerity. They stand for making us suffer. Quote, putting someone who will prioritize paying down the deficit ahead of all other concerns in charge is a recipe for cutting our earned benefits and turning the COVID recession into a depression. I think for many people it's a depression already, the most serious one since the depression of the 30s. Quote, rejecting Reed will be a major test for the soul of the Biden presidency, unquote. A longtime Democratic operatives advised and worked for Biden for years. Reed helped craft the 1996 welfare reform law that produced a massive surge in extreme poverty, inflicting severe damage on vulnerable children. Reed, who in 2016 characterized the law as an overall, quote, success, unquote, has also been credited with authoring Clinton's infamous vow to, quote, end welfare as we know it, unquote. In the wake of the American Prospects report last week that Reed is under consideration to head OMB, there were progressives who spotlighted Reed's role as executive director of the Bowles-Simpson Commission, as I mentioned earlier, the Cat Food Commission, an Obama administration initiative that recommended slashing Social Security benefits. Social Security Works, one of the backers of the new petition, said it is imperative to keep Reed and his toxic austerity politics out of the Biden administration, unquote. It's good that this time we really know who our enemies are. In the run-up to the Obama administration, we did not know, we did not have a clear perception who our enemies were. Now we know, and we're screaming about it, we're shouting about it, we're pressuring about it. That is good. Omar echoed that message in a tweet on Tuesday, declaring, quote, if the Biden administration is serious about protecting Medicare and Social Security, they must not appoint one of the biggest champions of cuts to lead their budget agency. And of course, she's quite right. Other signatories of the new position include the Working Families Party and Data for Progress, as well as Representatives-elect Cori Bush, who's a Missouri Democrat, and Jamal Bowman, incoming progressive members who have also spoken out against the Biden's team, reported consideration of Chicago Mayor Emanuel for a White House role. Quote, but Bruce Reed helped to develop the 94 crime bill, pushed broken windows policing, cuts to Social Security and Medicaid, Bush tweeted on Tuesday. That's Cori Bush, of course. Our Bush, not their Bush. Quote, we want an administration that prioritizes programs that protect us all. Mr. Reed is not someone our communities trust, unquote. So that pressure is now there and will intensify over the next a few days, and we will see how Biden goes. My own suspicion is that we may not be able to block them all, but we may be able to block some of them. Maybe Reid and Rahm, okay, or maybe Reid, okay, and Deese. I hope it's all three, because they're all so reprehensible and would be so bad at the National Economic Council or the Special Trade Representative, okay, or OMB, any of those three critical places. It would be a tragedy if they got into to any of them. So, one more thing, okay, I want to say about this before I continue your comments. You see that there are deficit hawks that still continue to hold sway with Joe Biden. Now, this in part, I think, is due to the fact that MMT efforts, okay, at lobbying over a period of time, even though these have been very successful in some ways, have not gone the whole way in one particular respect. Many of the MMTers and many of the most intellectually powerful ones, from the standpoint of the economics itself in this country, have not turned towards the debt subject to the limit, okay, the national debt, because they know that as a matter of economics, the level of the debt and the level of the debt to GDP ratio are not important for fiscal sustainability, are not important for fiscal responsibility. They haven't been that concerned with the fact that those who buy Treasury securities are making risk-free money because those debt securities are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. So they buy the Treasury securities and they get some risk-free interest, which is basically welfare for the rich. Lots of the MMT people are overlooking that. Well, they're not overlooking that. They know very well that's true. They just don't think it's a very important issue. And they keep on essentially trying to teach people, to tell people that the size of the debt and the size of the debt to GDP ratio are not important considerations. And they explain why. But this rational approach has not been particularly politically effective. It still leaves an opening for the people who are terrorists about the debt and terrorists about our deficits, because first, they conflate the deficit with the debt, because when we run deficits, we currently sell debt instruments. So the two are easily conflated. And once they're conflated, then the terrorists rant and rave and rail against the size of the national debt. and scare people when it comes to the national debt, because there are so many people that the MMT economists have not been able to reach among the mass of people. They need to be shown that the national debt does not matter, that it's a faux issue. I think the only way to really do that, make that visible to people, is to use the monetary sovereignty of the federal government to not only pay to not only produce the reserves necessary to spend all appropriations without selling any debt instruments, but it's also necessary to show people that at the same time reserves are being created for new spending, they're also being created for paying off the existing debt, so that you're illustrating to people over a period of months. It would only take a half year probably to demonstrate this, that the national debt can be paid off at will. I would say even if you want to do that for a year, let a huge percentage of the national debt be paid off. Then point out to people, look, it would be so easy to, it's so easy to do this. The debt is not a problem. It's under control all the time. We still might want to issue debt instruments because, and then give the reasons why it might be useful to continue to float debt instruments from time to time, to have the Treasury sell debt instruments from time to time. But the important thing is, you have to completely discredit the people who are complaining about the overwhelming debt our grandchildren are going to have. You have to completely discredit them before they will go away. And until they go away, they are a political problem. They are a political problem even now. Just yesterday, I talked about the Economic Policy Institute and Josh Bivens, and the fact that he was saying to people, heck, this is a great time. This is a great time to issue debt, to do deficit spending, and to pay for it through debt instruments. So he's saying this is a great time to finance what might be a $4 trillion recovery bill by selling debt instruments. Now, first of all, that's incorrect, because the debt instruments are not doing the financing. It's the Fed's power to fill the Treasury spending account that's actually doing the financing, and the Congress making the appropriation that does the financing. But also, secondly, okay, and apart from that, what happens after the $4 trillion is spent, and we have to do a lot more deficit spending to fuel the Green New Deal, and maybe to have Medicare for all, also for all of us, and maybe to do a job guarantee, and all these things. So the original $4 trillion is funded, and then here are the debt hawks again. They're still in the mix politically. They're still in the political system. They still have their think tanks. They still get called into Congress by the Republicans. They still get called into Congress. and they give these solemn testimonies about how really the unfunded liabilities of the federal government, projecting them all out to an infinite time horizon of $150 trillion, and we can't possibly afford that. And they get this respectful hearing from Congress every year. Maya McGuinness goes to the Congress and testifies this. She testifies about this, and the people listen respectfully. She gets a chance to go to Congress all the time. Our people don't, in order to put in a counter message. But I'm saying she's so full of crap, she shouldn't even get a chance to go to Congress at all. Everybody by now should know that she is full of crap, and that her think tank is full of crap, that the whole network of them is full of crap. But I think people will not believe they're full of crap until you get to the point where that national debt is going down easily and quickly. How do you do that? Well, you can do it using trillion-dollar coins. You can do it with overt congressional financing. I've waxed enthusiastic about those two things for some time. But it can easily be done. Do it through overt congressional financing for a year. See how it works out. I guarantee by the end of that year, no one will believe the national debt is a problem anymore. Only the QAnon nuts may still believe that it's a problem. But nobody who's sane is going to believe that it's a problem. Nobody who looks at the Treasury or the daily Treasury statement will believe, that it's a problem. Okay, so that's what I had for tonight. I will now consider your comments. Thank you for being here. I see we're down to just a few people, but I sure am glad to see you still here. And Romana says, pushback to Biden's fuckery. Where would we be without progressives? Kay says, I tagged Evelina Pont in my share. She missed it last night. I guess I've been over this a little bit. Kay says, hi, Evelina Alvarez says, I'm sure it's an FB glitch, probably. Dolores Pierce says, shared. Susan Eldridge says, hello. Hello, Susan. She says, listening while I'm prepping for Turkey Day. Avril says, so is Yellen a good pick or nominee? Well, it remains to be seen whether she is good enough. She's better than people he might have picked, for that particular situation. I mean, after all, he could have picked this guy, Biden Dees, for Treasury Secretary. Brian Dees, sorry. He could have picked Bruce Reed. I mean, so yeah, Yellen is probably a better pick than Larry Summers. Is she a good pick? It remains to be seen whether she is a sufficiently good pick. I would have felt a lot better if it had been Jamie Galbraith or Joe Stiglitz or Stephanie Kelton. I don't think it would be Stephanie because I think that Joe Biden would probably look at her as still a young economist on the way up, not sufficiently seasoned yet. You see, with Janet Yellen, he probably feels comfortable because Janet Yellen is 74. And Joe Stiglitz is probably about that age too. And I think Jamie Galbraith, I'm not sure how old he is, must be 66 or 67. I'm sure he's over 65, though. Kay says, my roommate and I are ordering dinner in tomorrow. Well, Kay, I hope it's a great dinner. And Dolores Pierce says, yes. Avril says, thank you for your feedback. Kay says, Joe, can you explain about the oncoming chance for another government shutdown? When is it? Will it screw up Social Security checks? Uh, the shutdown, I haven't been looking into the shutdown too much because I haven't been taking the shutdown that seriously. I don't think anybody wants a shutdown right now. I think they'll fight over it. I think what Mitch McConnell wants is a clean bill, so we have no shutdown. I think Nancy Pelosi wants to combine a bill to stop the shutdown with a relief bill. She's going to may try to use the prospect of a shutdown, okay, in order to get a relief bill in. I think there's going to be some angst about that. I don't know how, okay, it's going to work out. Okay, I think what's being passed here is an appropriation to keep the government from getting shut down. I don't think this is a debt limit crisis. As I say, I haven't been paying extremely close attention to it. So I've forgotten now whether it's a debt ceiling crisis, okay, or whether it's a budgetary crisis, which is going to require, okay, an appropriation. I believe it's the second. I think Mitch wants to just do a continuing resolution and forget about it. I think he probably wants to postpone a reckoning until next March or something like that. He probably wants to see how the Senate races are going to work out in Georgia, see whether he has control of the Senate, okay, or not. But he's got to do something. So since he's got to do something, he probably wants a CR. Okay, because if he's blamed for a government shutdown at this point, that's going to strengthen the run of the two Democrats in Georgia. If the blame can be placed, this is going to be political. If the blame can be placed, okay, I am pretty sure that no Social Security checks will be affected. The reason why no Social Security checks are going to be affected is because they are budgeted a year in advance. So the appropriation for this year's Social Security checks have already been made, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't think they're going to be a problem. And Kay says, are you sure? And Kay says, when is it? I think it is, I think the shutdown date, supposed shutdown date was December 12th or something like that. So we're nearing the time. I mean, they have to come back quickly to Congress after Thanksgiving, and they have to do something. Antonio Vocalha was here, and he says, to regulate the banks, government must raid the law offices so they come with bills once by universities, and not sure what Antonio was saying. Alvaro says, it's not too late to impeach the tangerine tyrant. That's true. Kay says he has already been impeached, just not removed by the Senate. Evelyn says Stiglitz would be great, but probably unlikely. Well, Stiglitz has held establishment spots before, and nothing has imploded. So, I mean, he doesn't bring down the establishment types of institutions. I'm sure he knows Biden. He's a very nice and very congenial guy. Biden would not have any problem in working with Joe Stiglitz, and he'd be great for the National Economics Council, And I think both the centrists with it inside of the Democratic Party, okay, and the progressives would respect him. He's a Nobel Prize winner. Romano says, well, they need a reminder, give them a door stain remover to remove the shit stain on liberty and decency. Avril says, do correction. Avril says, but these nuts. Evelina says, 68% will Biden listen. Kay says, 68% is a lot. Avril says, he better. Avril Mano says, a dirty rat fink at that. So you caught that, Avril, huh? That's good. Anyway, the point about the 68% is it's very good support, but remember, 88% of Democrats are for Medicare for all, and that fails to move the very stubborn Mr. Biden when he gets his set on something. He can get very, very stubborn. Avril says, I will never understand how folks like Yellen, who do nothing but work with currency, do not know macroeconomics. How is that possible? Well, in her case, she was a labor economist, which is not the same thing, okay, as a macroeconomist. Economists, tend to be very specialized. So she may work with currency and reserves, and she might know a lot about that. She might, know a lot about the mechanics of what happens at the Fed, but she might not know about the macroeconomic implications of that. Kay says Thom Hartmann brought up a rule in the Constitution about the VP being the president of the Senate. He's doing more research to see if that can happen now. The VP is the president of the Senate, but even though the VP is the president of the Senate, that means the VP convenes the Senate, but the VP can only vote in certain specific situations, according to the Constitution, specifically when there's a tie vote in the Senate. Then the VP can cast the tie-breaking vote. Howell says, not a Hartmann fan because last time I watched him, he was still taxes fund spending, which case misinformation, although I know he knows better. Yeah, by now he should know better. He's talked to Stephanie a few times at least. Evelina says, makes sense. Always thought it was the original intention. Actually, that way in Argentina, for example, where the U.S. Presidential model is used. Kay says, I've learned many things from him over the many years I have watched, listened to his show. I met Bernie there back years ago. Also, he's pretty strong on constitutional issues, Thom Hartmann. I think he tends to specialize in that. He learns about it. Kay says, I don't agree with all he says either, but still watch to learn what I can. So do I. I occasionally still watch Thom Hartmann. I used to watch a lot of Thom Hartmann along about 2008, 2009, 2010. Avril says, I question his agenda. It's not so much his agenda. I think it's basically our agenda that he shares. But I think he's like, he doesn't want to get too far away from what the establishment is saying. I think he's afraid he'll be considered to be non-relevant by people who have a modicum of power in the Congress, in the government. And he wants to be able to say things that those people might occasionally learn from. So I think that's where he's at over this. I trust his instincts, though, and I trust his ethics as well. Kay says, I'm all about learning things that are important to know. Kay says, suit yourself. Avril says, most definitely. Kay says, you don't have to buy the whole agenda to learn many things. Absolutely, Kay. Evelina says, knowing more about constitutional matters is important. So glad he's researching. Don't know anyone else who is right now. Kay says, exactly, Evelina. Kay says, I share his show on FB every day if you want to watch or listen, Evelina. Evelina is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. You bet it is. Article 1, Section 8 is one of the most important parts of the Constitution. Not simply about the currency and money, but it's about a whole lot of other things too. Kay says he's also on YouTube. Yes, I know he is. Kay says not sure about that. Evelina Pont. Article 1, Section 8 is definitely in the Constitution. There are more articles in Article 1, too. It doesn't end with Section 8. It's a very key article because remember, when the founders had implemented the Constitution, the first body in the Constitution is Congress, because the founders viewed Congress as likely the most powerful body in the Constitution. That was their intention. And they looked at the executive and the judicial branches as being checks on the Congress, who in their view had power to shackle both the executive and also the judiciary. Now, historically, that's not the way it's worked out. And the reason why is because of the popular vote for the president, in modern times. Now, I know the Electoral College determines the presidency, but it used to be the Electoral College was the electors were chosen by state legislatures. As long as that was the case, Congress was the more popular body. But when the state legislatures turned over authority by passing laws saying that the slates of electors will be consistent with the popular vote in their states, that made the president, the presidency, the more powerful branch of government. And the result of that has been really a pretty much continuous abdication of power in the 20th century by the Congress, until in our time the executive branch is certainly the most powerful and influential branch of government. Now, Congress could take back a lot of its power, but because of the way Congress operates, Congress people just don't have the guts to do that. It seems to them impractical to do it. What they seem to want to do most of all is to avoid taking responsibility for doing anything. They try to leave the tough decisions to the judicial branch or to the presidency. Alva says, good thing I'm not in Congress, because if one of those deficit hawks testifies before me, I would tell them, well, as long as I owe them, they'll never be broke. Susan Eldred says, how will Yellen be different from Stephen Mnuchin? Okay, I'm frankly not sure she will be different in relation to. I'm waiting to see what position she's going to take when it comes to the deficit. Okay, I know this. She'll be much more concerned about shackling Wall Street, not doing things for Wall Street, for making Wall Street stop the looting. She'll be concerned about the looting of the private sector by Wall Street. She'll be concerned about the growing degree, of inequality, and will be supportive of fiscal action to stop that. Now, the question is she ready to leave the deficit debt questions behind? And maybe just a few days with Stephanie, just a day or two with Stephanie, might fix whatever problem she has in that particular direction. If she can be persuaded, and she has a lot of knowledge about how the Fed operates, Stephanie will be able to talk within that particular framework. They will have shared knowledge about how the Fed operates. If Stephanie can explain to her why that means that there is never a fiscal sustainability problem, so she doesn't have to worry about the debt. If Stephanie can explain that to her, then she could well become a very radical Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, she could become a historic Secretary of the Treasury. She certainly has the brains to do that. And I think she has the concern for the public to do that. Alvaro says, hi, Bonnie.
Hi.
And Alvaro says, Dr. Joe, I knew it was in the Constitution, just checking it if those that follow Hartman knew. It's not a good sign that she belongs to the CFRB. The Committee for a Responsible Budget. Is the CFRB the Maya McGinnis group? I'm forgetting the initials. I always get them all mixed up. Okay, I have to check my own book about that. I have to check my 2 books about the Peterson Network because I've forgotten at this moment what CFRB stands for. Avril says, maybe we need to leave/post your readings of Stephanie's book on Yellen's Facebook page. Yeah, why not?
She may have gotten it already.
Yeah, but it won't hurt to post those readings on her Facebook page, Susan Eldridge says. But Christine Lagarde has said publicly the ECB can't default. I want to hear Yellen say this. Me too. I'd love to hear her say this. I'd love to hear her say that. I think she knows it, though. Committee for a Fiscally Responsible Budget, CFRB, yeah. I think that is the Maya McGinnis group. So what connection does Yellen have to that group? Is she on their trustees board or something like that? If she is, I don't think that necessarily means that she holds the same views, okay, as they do. Okay, because a group like that would get any number of people as parts of the board of advisors or the trustees, okay, or anything like that. And they could well have people, who are moderates, okay, with respect to the deficit. Okay, yeah. So, she could be on the board, okay, of directors. She might have consented to be. It means that she gets some fees for that and stuff like that. That would not surprise me, okay, at all. But I wouldn't consider it to be strong evidence of support for the views, okay, of Maya McGinnis and the management of the CFRB. Susan Eldridge says, posted on Twitter today. Okay, Susan, that's good. Thank you. Anyway, the CFRB and its activities are described in detail in but both in volume 1 and volume 2, okay, of my books about real fiscal responsibility. The first book is about the progressive give up formula, and the second book is about the Peterson Network, an important part of which was the CFRB. Anyway, I am now caught up to you. You have caught up to me. I have caught up to you. So, unless you have some further comments, I'm going to wish you a happy Thanksgiving. And I'm going to say good night. And Susan said we should follow Yellen on Twitter. Absolutely. We should follow her on Twitter. And we should tweet a lot of MMT at her. Alvaro says, love the show tonight, but Dr. Joe, you're the only one I'll follow right now because I value your expertise and wisdom. And what a treasure you are. Thank you, Alvaro.
Thank you.
I certainly appreciate that. And Dolores says, thank you, okay, and good night all. The reason why I appreciate it is I work hard on these shows. What I mean by saying that is that when things happen, okay, on a day-to-day basis, and there are all these different kinds of news happening, and to do a show like this and not to have it completely disconnected, you have to find a way to take various articles and to integrate them into a perspective for each show. I find that to be creative, but also difficult. Maybe that's why I find it to be, a creative thing to do. But I always try to do that with this show. So rather than you getting a disconnected set of news articles, you get something that is integrated. I try to get an integrated way of actually presenting the news happenings in each show. And I see myself as definitely doing a news show. And that's one reason why, it's long. So anyway, happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving.
And good night. Steve Wolfbrand says, corporations for fucking rich billionaires. Yes. Kay says, thank you for another great discussion. I learned a lot from these discussions too. Wish I could remember all that I learned on all shows I listen to, but my brain isn't what it used to be. Laugh out loud. I know you work hard for all of us, Joe. I appreciate your work greatly. Alvaro says, and your instinct for integration is worth everything. Steve Wolfbrand says, happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to you too, Steve Wolfbrand. I hope you have a wonderful time tomorrow.
Yeah.
We are prepared to have a wonderful time here. The only thing is, we miss our grandchildren who are in Williamsburg celebrating Thanksgiving down there rather than being at home here. We miss our son. He is here, but of course we can't really spend it with him due to COVID. And our daughter is in Los Angeles because she moved there, a few years ago. And of course, we can't see her either because of COVID. So we are very reliant on
FaceTime.
Either FaceTime or Skype or social media to interact. Happy Thanksgiving Day, everyone. And we love you too, Kay. And you take care. Have a wonderful day tomorrow. I hope that dinner is great. Steve says gobble, gobble. We're not going to gobble, gobble. You can gobble, gobble if you want to, Steve, but we're not going to gobble, gobble. Okay, good night, folks.